Hello, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Amanda Hammond, and I have to tell you, it's been a little while since I've given a live presentation. I'm feeling the adrenaline rush. I'm used to like the little gallery of people where I can sort of move them off to the side so I don't get distracted. So anyway, it's lovely to be here. And thank you so much for having me to talk about what I am really excited about, because I think it's a wonderful little tool for you to put into your arsenal, your little toolkit. And that is the wonderful world of single subject INDs. And they particularly come in handy when we're dealing with cellular products, when the product is out of specification. So if you haven't had to deal with this before, pay attention. Hopefully you will be able to go back to your institution and say, hey, I've got a really great tool I can use when needed. Of course, with everything, when we're dealing with the regulations, lots of little requirements and little details, but it's not overwhelming. And I'm happy to say that the FDA has actually been responsive, I think, to the needs, especially in this space, and have really tried to streamline it. So without further ado, I'm just going to jump in, and hopefully I will lose some of this super nerdy regulatory enthusiasm. Not too much, though. Okay, I forgot to ask, how do I move this along? Oh, okay, I figured it out. All right, so quick refresh. And what I love about this talk, and I'm really appreciative to the speakers beforehand, because I think they've laid a really nice foundation for standard of care, research, all the roles and responsibilities that go into supporting a research. But as we know, the FDA is regulating many of these products, like the devices, drugs, biologics, and they're regulating these products that are both approved, meaning typically part of standard of care, unless it's off-label use, right? It's still part of standard of care, and then unapproved. And if it's unapproved, we're typically using them in clinical trials. But every now and then we get a scenario like the one we presented here, where we may be seeing a patient, they have a life-threatening disease, they've exhausted all of the available options, maybe in the standard of care setting. Can we put them on a clinical trial? Is there something that's going to be available? Sadly, for any number of reasons, we don't have something for them. But there is the physician has identified investigational drug, let's say, and they think this really is the best option for the patient. So it's either not open at their site, maybe they closed it to enrollment, or the patient doesn't meet the clinical trial eligibility, but there's some reason why they're not able to move on to a clinical trial. What do we do? Because we really want to make sure that we're able to treat the patients, right? So the physician thinks, yeah, this is a good option, treatment X. And fortunately for us, the FDA has sort of a long-standing history of trying to come up with mechanisms to provide patients with access to treatments, and which they've done here. We call it the expanded access, or compassionate use is a term that you may have heard, but basically this is to allow patients with serious or life-threatening illnesses access to investigational drugs, biologics, medical devices for the treatment outside of a clinical trial. This is a key bit here when there's no comparable or satisfactory alternative therapy option that is available. So again, that's why it's a nice little thing to have in your back pocket if ever you run into this situation. So let's get into a few of the details around expanded access requirements. These are really set forth in, just because I love to go back to the regulations, you'll see a lot of regulatory references. Don't worry, I've kind of listed all the criteria out here for you. But basically, they've set out some pretty specific guidelines and criteria that really need to be met in order to be able to proceed. And so, typically the physician is working with the patient to make sure that this is sort of something they may be interested in. But you have to provide sufficient information to the FDA and what we call an IND application, or investigational new drug application. But the FDA has to make a determination that the patient has a serious or immediately life-threatening disease or condition. I've got some definitions on the next slide for you that sort of goes into that. Again, no comparable or satisfactory alternative therapy is available. So they may have already exhausted standard of care options. Maybe the clinical trial is closed, those types of things. There's going to be potential benefit to the patient. And I think one of our earlier speakers had spoken to that. Providing the risks are not unreasonable. So we're doing that risk benefit determination there. Providing the investigational drug will not interfere with the initiation, the conduct, or completion of another clinical investigation. and the patient cannot obtain the drug under another IND or protocol. So, all of this is done based on what the physician is providing, and the physician, of course, is looking at the risks of moving forward with the investigational drug and making sure that, compared with the disease or the condition that they may have. So the regulations have nicely, I think, laid out the criteria that need to be looked at here. So as I mentioned, there are some additional definitions that I think will help, the clinical providers in their determination as to whether to move forward with this as a particular option. So FDA has defined an immediately life-threatening disease or condition, and we have that up here. I think some of the key things here is that it doesn't necessarily have to be tomorrow or the next day, but there's a reasonable likelihood that death will occur within a matter of months, or in which premature death is likely without early treatment. So it's a little broader than we have to get like emergency. They're expected to expire this week, although there are mechanisms for when that is expected. Okay, and then we have serious disease or condition. And this means a disease or condition associated with morbidity that has substantial impact on the day-to-day functioning. There are some further definitions that we have listed here. I won't go through those. I'm trying to make up just a little bit of time for us. Okay. So what I've listed here, and I know Jennifer went through and provided a lot of the responsibilities of the team here, because we're talking about treatment use. I just wanted to sort of focus on the physician responsibilities here. Again, they're going to work with their team to make sure that there are no available clinical trials for the patients. It really is important at the outset to really make sure that the patient's current disease or condition qualifies for the expanded access as defined on the previous slides. Also identify the appropriate expanded access request type. So we're going to get into that a little bit further on. But oftentimes institutions will have like a regulatory affairs office. If not, there's an IRB office that you can consult with, and they will help you determine the IND type. So again, I don't think anybody should feel like they're on their own. And as a last recourse, you can always call the FDA. They have, they're always willing to help in these situations if you're uncertain which request type to use. And then also confirm with the manufacturer that they will provide the investigational product. This is kind of a key thing. They are not required to allow you to use the product outside of the existing clinical trial. So you really do need to make sure early on that they're willing to provide that product. So, this is an important step before you go into all of the work of pulling together the application and submitting it to the FDA. So really recommend having those conversations early on with the manufacturer. And then, of course, in the management of the use of the investigational product, I think Jennifer went through a number of these items, again, with the patients, right? As part of that informed consent process, evaluate the potential risks and benefits. Most often, we use the term sponsor here. It's really who is holding the IND. For many of these single subject INDs, you have the manufacturer. It's going to be company X. Oftentimes when we're doing a single subject, so an expanded access application for one patient, oftentimes it is the treating physician. They become the physician investigator. They're going to be the ones holding the IND, in part because they know most of the information about the patient's background. So oftentimes they're the ones that are submitting the investigational product. But for example, at our institution, we have some products for which our institution is holding the IND. Technically, our institution could also, submit those as well as the sponsor. Of course, we have to obtain informed consent from the patient. And I just want to be clear, this is not our standard walk through the door consent to treat the patient. We're using an unapproved product. So again, it's that research informed consent that's typically approved by the IRB. And then managing the treatment. And then also we have our responsibilities to make sure that we're reporting adverse events, unanticipated problems to all of those regulatory bodies. We treat it like even though we're treating the patient, we treat it like we're managing it like it's a research study. Okay. And the investigator, physician, could also delegate these responsibilities. All right. So here are the two types when we're talking about a single patient expanded access IND. There's also one for immediate sized populations, and then there's sort of a wide treatment use. We're going to focus here on the single patient, right? How we can get them the product. The investigational agent. So there are two types of really it's one, but we kind of differentiate, I think, some of the provisions as we get into it through emergency versus non-emergency. So let's start with the non-emergency. And typically when we think about what constitutes an emergency, it's all about time. Time is of the essence. And a lot of folks will look at, is there time to convene the IRB to do a review? Again, we're submitting an IND, it's like a research study. If we don't have time to get our IRB together, then that makes the case for it being an emergency single patient IND, or at least that's one of the factors we look at. So in terms of the non-emergency situation, again, we talked about the manufacturer approval. This needs to be documented. It can't just be verbal. You do have to actually submit a letter of authorization from the developer. And this just allows us to cross-reference some of the information related to the product. You need the FDA authorization. When we submit INDs to the FDA, the whole sort of application packet, typically for a typical IND, so your run-of-the-mill clinical trial, they have 30 days to review. And unless they tell you, oh, we want more information, we're going to put a hold on this, typically you have the green light to proceed. But because these are sort of, we got to move quickly on these, if you let the FDA know that you're submitting a single subject IND, they will do a response within 24 hours to a week. There may be some consultation in there, but they do work really hard, at least we found, to really move these along. Of course, we need prospective IRB approval. That means we can't treat until we get their IRB approval first. And we also need to obtain informed consent, research-informed consent from the patient. Now, as I mentioned, if it's an emergency situation, right, time is of the essence. FDA moves they're willing to move a little bit quicker, so they may actually give a verbal or telephonic approval to be able, or authorization to be able to proceed. But you have to agree that you're going to get the rest of the application materials into them within 15 days of their giving the green light to proceed. Okay, and also to include that letter of authorization. Again, I think the general thought is, time is of the essence. We all need to sort of make some sort of, need to have a system that's not going to hold up providing critical care to the patients. On the topic of prospective IRB, right? Here, again, timing is of the essence. So the IRB, you don't technically need to submit to the IRB and get their approval if you are getting an emergency IND authorization from the FDA. However, you do have to let the IRB know 5 days after you have used the product. 5 days after, you have to report to the IRB with a copy of the consent, status of the patient. I have a little asterisk here on this one because I always encourage everybody to check in with their IRB office. Some institutions may have local requirements that say, look, technically you don't have to submit, but we're requiring you to at least consult with our office or give us a heads up that this is coming. So, just a little note, I think it's always good to check in with your Reg Affairs office and check in with the IRB office regardless, even if you think you're proceeding with an emergency IND, because they can also help you potentially with some of the pieces for that submission. And then again, there are informed consent requirements. So while you may not have IRB approval in advance, there is still an expectation that you obtain informed consent consistent with the elements of a research-informed consent. So you're basically putting a research-informed consent together. It has all of the pieces that you would normally have. The only difference is you haven't got IRB approval yet. Okay, you're going to submit it 5 days afterwards. So those are some of the big items that really make up the packet. So when you actually break it down, yes, a couple of organizations and entities that you need to work with, but all very doable, especially if this is going to provide benefit to the patient. Okay, so a couple of additional notes on emergency use. So the general rule is get IRB approval unless it is, we really need to get the product to the patient sooner than the IRB is able to convene. And so if you don't get IRB approval first, because it's emergency, then you have to report within 5 days. So I think it's always important to think about, like, what is an emergency use? It's the test article on a human subject in again, similar language to what we see in the single subject IND or the expanded access provisions, life-threatening situation in which there's no standard acceptable treatment that's available and in which there is insufficient time to obtain IRB approval. So emergency use applies to an individual patient. That's really important. So if another circumstance comes up where you want to treat another patient with the same unapproved product outside of clinical trial, technically, you're supposed to submit that as a separate investigation or a clinical trial or maybe a separate single patient IND. But of course, the FDA acknowledges they don't want to be responsible for, or it's inappropriate to deny emergency treatment to a second individual when the only obstacle is the lack of IRB review and approval. But, generally when you've gone through this one time, that the second time isn't quite so. You've kind of got everything pulled together. And later on in the presentation, you'll see there's a wonderful little thing that the FDA has put in place that also allows expedited review. So this should become less of an issue for teams moving forward. Okay. Informed consent. There's one additional piece, and I won't go into too much detail here, but occasionally, if it's life-threatening, it's an emergency situation, you may come across a situation where the patient is maybe they no longer have capacity to provide informed consent. And for whatever reason, a legally authorized representative is not available to provide informed consent. So the FDA has come up with some provisions to allow you to still proceed without obtaining informed consent, but they are very specific criteria that need to be met. And that is, again, the patient is in a life-threatening situation. You cannot obtain informed consent, insufficient time to obtain consent from the legally authorized representative, and there is no alternative therapy available. Now, all of those, it needs to be certified in writing, not just by the investigator, but also by a non-participating physician. So at least you have that consultation with another provider. And of course, all of this must be reported to the IRB within 5 working days of the treatment. So here's the little trick that I think is really wonderful in terms of these submissions. So I'm sure many of you have not actually had, or maybe you have, I'm not sure. If you haven't, typically your IND applications require what they call a cover sheet. And there is a form FDA 1571. That's a lovely form that serves as that cover sheet for all types of IND submissions. And that's part of the problem, is it really isn't tailored to an expanded access request. There's a lot of information that typically the manufacturers have that a physician who's trying to move quickly on this won't have access to. And so the FDA recently came up with a new form FDA 3926, and it is a wonderful streamlined alternative. It's much easier to complete. Again, if you have a Reg Affairs office, they would like that. But here's another reason why I think it's really important to use this form. You can still fill out the 1571, but the nice thing about the 3926, I feel like I'm speaking in a different language all of a sudden. Okay, so the 3926, there's a field in there that is really important to check off, in my opinion, especially when time is of the essence. Because if you check off box 10B, that allows, instead of waiting for a convened IRB, that whole committee to get together, some places they may have an IRB every week, some places once a month, and some places they're able to get everybody together pretty quickly. But regardless, you can actually waive the review and approval by a convened IRB. So still the chair will review it, but at least it kind of gives a little bit more flexibility to get fewer people than the convened IRB to do the review. And so that's what that law's bullet really is. The physician has to obtain the concurrence by the IRB chairperson or somebody designated on the IRB before the treatment use. So this gives a little bit of flexibility with that when timing is of the essence. Okay, just a couple of additional considerations. So we talked about the holders of an existing IND, sort of that they're the ones that are submitting. So this is just some vocabulary nuance. But if you have an existing IND application, one approach you could take is to amend it. But many times, as we said, it's the manufacturer that's holding the original IND, and then it's the physician that's submitting the single subject IND. So it's always going to be a single patient IND. But let's say we had a situation where the manufacturer is submitting it, they would just call it a single patient protocol because they would probably submit it as another protocol under their existing IND. Doesn't come up too often, just thought I would make a note. And the other thing that's really interesting too is when the FDA receives a significant number of individual patient expanded access requests, they can actually come back and say, look, consolidate it into an expanded access protocol for an intermediate sized population. Like, okay, we have enough experience. We know who's going to be coming in. Let's just create a protocol that is broad enough in terms of the eligibility so we don't have to do all of this regulatory paperwork every single time. So that's a really nice mechanism that's available as well. I don't know how often the FDA actually makes that request, but at least they've left it in there for them to do that. Okay, and so of course, just a few, we kind of covered some of this requirements after treatment use. This is a little bit more from the IRB perspective, still required to do continuing reviews on an annual basis. Any changes to the treatment plan that had been submitted, those need to be reported to the IRB and to the FDA. Continue to track those adverse events per your local policy, report those to the IRB. And then once the treatment use has ended, provide a summary report to the FDA. Okay, so that's just general single patient INDs. This I think is really, really helpful, especially in the space of the cellular commercial products, because what often comes up. Well, let's just take a little bit of a step back. So I think you guys know in 2000, I think it was around 2017, finally we're seeing some of these cellular products get approved at really exciting time, a lot of buzz. And then about, once we start getting in there, we realize, okay, there's some unique challenges, especially in the autologous setting, right? Because some of the products were coming back out of specification for release. So what do we do now? Now we have a product that we're not necessarily able to, it's not meeting the release criteria. What do we do? And given the personalized nature, especially in the autologous product, what do? We've got a patient that's already started going down the road here. Do we not give them the product? Is there a mechanism to get it to them? If, again, that risk benefit determination, we think it's in the best interest of the patient and there are no other alternatives. Well, this is a really good discussion. So technically the FDA says if it's out of specification, we're not able to use the product. And so in sort of the scenarios that we frequently come about or start to see, it's like lower number of cells, the ratios are off, maybe lower potency than expected, those types of things. So how do we move forward? Well, technically, it's not consistent with the criteria to release, so it becomes unapproved. And so we revert back to our expanded access pathway. So there's one addition here. I think with some of the sponsors early on, like Novartis and Kite Gilead, they had, obviously they're aware of a number of these studies or products being released that are out of specification. So what do? Okay, let's get ahead of it. So they actually put together an intermediate sized expanded access protocol. They called it a managed access program, or at least Novartis did. And so if you find yourself in the situation where you've got a commercial product and it's not available, it's out of specification, check to see if your institution has one of these expanded access protocols or managed access protocols available and open. If not, then you would go down the pathway of, okay, can we do a single patient IND? And if it's an emergency situation, can we run down the path of an emergency use IND? So here are just a couple of examples of expanded access protocols for intermediate sized populations. They've really taken off. And another term for out of spec, you'll see they'll use the term non-conforming. I'm not even going to dare pronounce any of these drug names or product names because, well, I just can't. But this is just a very limited list, and you will see that it does, there are several more out there, and actually in other product types as well. And I've included the NCT numbers so you can look them up on clinicaltrials.gov if you're really interested. So since Novartis, they put out one of the earliest expanded access programs, I just wanted to share with you some of the criterion to be able to move forward. And as you can see, a lot of it is built around safety, again, that risk benefit. So in order to be able to put a patient on this particular protocol and receive the out of specification product, it still had to be consistent with the prescribing information. So you follow that plan. But you're just not unable to receive the commercially manufactured product due to, and they list some of these situations. So failure of the incoming apheresis material to meet the acceptance specifications, the outgoing product didn't meet the release specifications, so that often comes up. Or there may be other specification within the prescribing information. So those are some of the areas. And this is where I think 3 is really critical. No overwhelming safety concerns have been identified for manufacture and release of the out of specification product. For this particular study, they had included a provision. You have to reach out to them, have a discussion with their medical team to make sure that they also agree that it's okay to proceed. So there are some additional steps. It's not like you just proceed. So, because safety is such a big issue with these protocols, there may be things like it may be out of specification because of sterility issues, endotoxin, some of these other, I'm not in the manufacturing space, so I'm just repeating what they tell me. These are some of the things, obviously, we don't go forward with those safety issues, but if it's about the potency, maybe fewer cells, then it may be okay. But again, this is where I think the clinical judgment really comes into play. And again, your institutions may have a committee or a team that helps the treating physician with some of those determinations. A couple of closing considerations. Connect with the manufacturer as soon as possible. Make sure that they're comfortable moving forward because you don't want to do all of the work only to find out that they're going to decline the request. I always recommend reaching out to your institutional resources. Take advantage of the teams that are really experts here. And if they're not experts, help them become experts now that you have this wonderful little tidbit to share with them. And also there may be some local policies and procedures as well in place. And I strongly recommend the use of FDA form 3926. That's a number to remember, if anything, from this presentation, because it will really help you be a more streamlined application and also will allow sort of an expedited review by your IRB chair, which helps move things along. And with that, I'm included a few resources, and I'm very happy to turn it over to not Jamie Wagner, but Monica Nieses. Will be presenting next. Thank you so much, everybody.